The chandeliers of Hartwick House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light cascading over silk and jewels, over powdered wigs and polished boots, over the cream of London society gathered for the season's most anticipated ball in the autumn of 1818. The ballroom stretched vast and glittering, its walls adorned with gilt mirrors that multiplied the splendor infinitely, reflecting back the swirl of dancers in their finery, the flutter of fans painted with pastoral scenes, the gleam of champagne in crystal flutes. Music swelled from the musicians' gallery, violins and cellos, weaving melodies that spoke of romance and possibility, of fortunes to be made and hearts to be won. Yet at the periphery of this magnificence, where the candlelight grew dimmer and the marble floor met the shadows, stood Miss Eleanor Hartley, as still as a portrait in a frame she no longer quite fit. Her gown was silk once. The fabric had been her mother's favorite, a pale rose that in its prime had caught the light, like morning on water. But 3 seasons of wear had faded it to something closer to winter's last blush, the color of flowers pressed too long between the pages of a book. She had altered it herself each year, letting out seams here, adding fresh trim there, replacing the original Belgian lace with cheaper muslin ribbon that she'd carefully stitched to mimic the pattern of what had been lost. The bodice had been taken in twice, the hem let down once and then shortened again when the fabric grew too threadbare at the bottom, the sleeves reshaped from the fuller style of 1815 to the more fitted fashion now favored. If one looked closely, and Eleanor knew that society always looked closely, one could see the tiny, precise stitches where she had mended a tear near the waist, could notice that the ribbon at the neckline did not quite match the undertone of the silk, could observe that the dress fit her well enough but not perfectly, in the mark of home alteration rather than a modist's skilled hand. She stood with her back very straight, her chin lifted just so, her gloved hands folded before her in a posture her mother had taught her. Dignity, always dignity, even when the world offers you none. Around her swirled the daughters of earls and viscounts, their gowns pristine and new, their jewels genuine, their laughter careless in the way that only true security allows. They danced past her in a blur of emerald and sapphire, of ivory and gold, their slippers never touching the same spot twice, while Eleanor remained rooted to her shadowed corner, observing rather than participating, present but not quite included. She told herself it was pride that kept her here, that she chose this distance, but beneath that pride lay something else, a quiet shame that burned like fever, the knowledge that she was seen, that her worn silk was noted and remarked upon in whispers behind fans, that she had become a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about the perils of reduced circumstances. The gown had been beautiful once, had been her mother's joy, worn to assemblies and dinners when Papa was still alive and their modest estate still solvent, when Eleanor had been a child who believed that worth was measured in character rather than clothing. Now it hung on her like a ghost, a reminder of everything lost, yet she wore it with a strange defiance, this shabby armor against a world that had already judged her and found her wanting. The arrival of Lucian Blackwell, Duke of Ashford, was marked not by fanfare but by a sudden hush that rippled through the ballroom like frost spreading across glass, a collective intake of breath as the assembled company turned to observe the man whose very presence seemed to lower the temperature of any room he entered. He stood in the doorway, tall and austere in impeccable black evening clothes that emphasized the severity of his bearing, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, though he could not be above 35, his face carved with the sharp precision of a monument to coldness, itself high cheekbones, a jaw that might have been sculpted from marble, lips pressed into a thin line that suggested neither pleasure nor displeasure, but rather a profound indifference to all human sentiment. His eyes, though, his eyes were what truly marked him as separate from ordinary men, for they were grey as winter ice, grey as stone beneath water, and they surveyed the glittering assembly with such visible disdain that even the boldest of the marriage-minded mothers felt their ambitions wither under that glacial gaze. He had been widowed 5 years, a tragedy that had transformed him from what gossip suggested had been a relatively amiable young duke into this frozen fortress of a man who attended society functions only when obligation absolutely demanded it, who danced with no one, spoke to few, and seemed to carry about him an atmosphere of such profound chill that even the curious learned to keep their distance. He moved through the crowd now with the grace of a man entirely comfortable with his own power and entirely uninterested in wielding it for anything so trivial as social advancement, his progress marked by bowing heads and murmured greetings that he acknowledged with the barest inclination of his head, his attention already moving beyond each speaker before they had finished their obsequious pleasantries. Lucien's internal landscape was one of barren contempt as he observed the peacocks around him. These creatures who measured their worth in the cut of a coat or the size of a dowry, who smiled with their mouths while calculating advantage with their eyes, who spoke of love while meaning property and position, all of it a grand masquerade of meaninglessness that he was condemned to witness by the simple accident of his birth and title. It was as he surveyed this theatre of pretension that his gaze fell upon her, upon the young woman standing in the shadows at the ballroom's edge, and she arrested his attention not because she was beautiful, though there was a certain austere elegance to her features, but because she was the only person in the entire assembly who was not watching him, not angling for his notice, not performing for his benefit. She stood quite still in her faded rose gown, her attention fixed on something beyond the dancers, her expression composed yet melancholic, and for a moment their eyes met across the crowded room, a brief collision of glances that revealed nothing, yet somehow acknowledged everything. Her recognition of his notorious coldness, his observation of her worn silk, and what it signified, a mutual understanding that they were both present in this glittering world, yet not truly of it. He noticed the precise stitching where her gown had been mended, the cheaper ribbon that betrayed economy, the proud set of her shoulders that declared she would not apologize for her circumstances, and something in him that was not quite interest, but rather a cold assessment, formed the judgment that here was pride, meeting necessity, dignity, clothing itself in whatever fabric remained, a sight that in another man might have provoked sympathy, but in the Duke of Ashford produced only the cataloguing observation that even in reduced circumstances, some maintained their bearing while others dissolved into obsequious desperation, and she, evidently, had chosen the former path. The cruelty, when it came, arrived with the crystalline clarity of breaking glass, cutting through the music and laughter with a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, a voice that belonged to Lady Cecilia Fairfax, a debutante whose beauty was matched only by her talent for calculated malice, and she stood now with a cluster of similarly adorned young women, their heads bent together in that particular configuration of feminine conspiracy that always preceded public humiliation. "My dears," Lady Cecilia proclaimed, her tone dripping with false sympathy as her gaze fixed deliberately upon Eleanor's corner, "I do believe Miss Hartley has discovered the secret to eternal fashion. One simply wears the same gown for 3 seasons and declares it timeless rather than tiresome." The laughter that followed was like ice cracking, sharp and brittle, spreading through the nearby guests as heads turned to observe Eleanor standing frozen in her faded rose silk. And though she kept her expression carefully neutral, though she maintained the composure her mother had taught her, was armor against the world's cruelties, something inside her chest constricted painfully, a tightening of shame and anger that made breathing suddenly difficult. Another voice joined the chorus, belonging to a matron whose own daughter had failed to secure a single dance that evening. Indeed, such admirable economy, though one wonders if perhaps the fabric might be better suited to household curtains at this point. The Duke of Ashford stood near enough to hear every word, his grey eyes observing this display of social savagery with the detached interest of a naturalist, watching predators circle wounded prey, his expression revealing nothing that might be construed as sympathy or disgust, merely that same cold assessment that characterized all his observations of society's theatre. Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze join the others, felt the accumulation of judgment pressing down upon her shoulders, and though she had endured whispers before, had learned to ignore the sideways glances and pitying smiles, this public exhibition of her poverty struck something deeper, cracking the careful dignity she had constructed around her reduced circumstances like a fist through thin ice. She excused herself with a murmur that no one bothered to acknowledge, moving through the crowd with her head still high but her vision blurring at the edges, navigating by memory toward the French doors that led to the balcony, seeking the refuge of darkness and cold air, anywhere that she might collect the fragments of her composure before they scattered completely beyond retrieval. The November night received her with a shock of cold that felt almost merciful against her burning cheeks, the balcony empty save for the stone balustrade and the skeletal shadows of the garden below, and she gripped the cold stone with both hands, fighting the tears that threatened to betray her pride, telling herself that she would not weep, would not give them even that satisfaction, though her throat ached with the effort of containing her humiliation. She did not hear his approach, did not sense his presence, until his voice cut through the darkness with that same cold precision that characterized everything about him. They perform their cruelty with such practiced ease, do they not? One might almost admire the efficiency if the spectacle were not so utterly predictable. Eleanor turned to find the Duke of Ashford standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the ballroom's light, his expression unreadable in the shadows, but his tone carrying no warmth, no comfort, merely that detached observation that somehow felt worse than the mockery she had just escaped. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I did not realize you had followed me." And there was in her tone a question that was also a challenge, a demand to know whether he had come to deliver his own cutting remarks about her circumstances. He moved onto the balcony properly, the door closing behind him and muting the music to a distant melody, his grey eyes finding hers in the moonlight, and when he spoke, his words were not kind but rather brutally honest, in a way that stripped away all pretense. "I did not follow you out of kindness, Miss Hartley, but rather curiosity. I wished to observe whether you would crumble or endure, whether your pride was genuine or merely performance, for I have found that society's judgments, however cruel, do reveal character in those they condemn." Eleanor felt anger kindle beneath her shame, felt her spine straighten with indignation at his clinical dissection of her pain, and she met his cold gaze with heat of her own as she replied, "And what has your observation revealed, Your Grace? That poverty makes one suitable for study, that reduced circumstances provide entertainment for those whose fortunes remain intact." Something that might have been approval flickered across his severe features, though his voice remained frost-touched as he responded, "It has revealed that you possess more dignity in that worn gown than they possess in all their pristine silk combined, though I suspect you know this already, and find it cold comfort when faced with their mockery." They stood there in the November cold, two figures separate from the warmth and light behind them, and in that moment Eleanor perceived not a potential ally, but merely another observer of her misfortune, another aristocrat whose wealth insulated him from understanding, and she turned away from him to face the darkened garden, her voice quiet but firm as she said, "If you will excuse me, Your Grace, I prefer my humiliation without an audience." Her words a dismissal even as she remained acutely aware that he had not moved, that he continued to watch her with those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every emotion she fought to conceal. 3 days passed, in which Eleanor attempted to return to the small routines that constituted her life, the careful management of their modest household, the stretching of resources that never quite stretched far enough, the tending to her Aunt Josephine whose health grew more fragile with each passing winter, and she had almost convinced herself that the encounter on the balcony had been merely another humiliation to catalogue and forget when the brass knocker sounded against their townhouse door with an authority that made their elderly maid startle in the hallway. Eleanor looked up from the household accounts she had been reviewing, her pen poised above figures that refused to balance no matter how many times she recalculated them, and heard voices in the entrance, their maid's nervous flutter. Then a deeper tone that carried the unmistakable weight of aristocratic command, and her heart performed an uncomfortable acceleration in her chest as she recognized that voice even before the maid appeared in the doorway of their shabby sitting room, her eyes wide with poorly concealed alarm, to announce that His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, requested an audience with Miss Hartley. The room itself seemed to shrink as he entered, his tall frame and immaculate attire serving only to emphasize the threadbare gentility of their circumstances, the faded wallpaper that Eleanor's mother had once thought charming, the furniture that had been elegant a generation ago but now showed its age in worn upholstery and joints that creaked with every movement, the carefully darned curtains that let in too much light through their thinning fabric, and Eleanor felt the weight of his grey gaze cataloguing every evidence of their reduced state as she rose to greet him with what dignity she could muster. He wasted no time on pleasantries, declining her offer of tea with a curt gesture, instead launching directly into speech with that same cold precision that characterized all his interactions. "Miss Hartley, I have come on a matter of business, not courtesy, and I trust you will appreciate directness over the usual social pretensions." Eleanor remained standing, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling, watching as he continued without waiting for her response. "My late wife established a charitable foundation that has languished without proper management since her death 5 years ago, and I find myself in need of someone with both intelligence and organizational capability to resume its operations. I am prepared to offer you the position of director, with a salary of £300 per annum, lodging at my country estate when required, and full authority over the foundation's charitable disbursements within the budget I shall provide." The sum he named was staggering, more than Eleanor had seen in the 3 years since her father's death, enough to secure physicians for her aunt, to pay their mounting debts, to purchase necessities they had learned to live without, and yet even as desperate hope kindled in her chest, pride rose to meet it with suspicion. For why would a duke offer such a position to a woman he had spoken to exactly once, a woman whose only qualification was evident poverty, and whose circumstances made her dependent enough to be grateful for any opportunity? She met his cold gaze with her own steady one, as she asked the question that burned beneath her gratitude. "Your Grace, I must inquire whether this offer is genuine employment or merely charity disguised as such, for I will not accept the latter no matter how prettily it is packaged." Something that might have been approval flickered in those grey eyes as he responded, "I suspected you would ask precisely that question, which is why I have brought the Foundation's current records for your examination. You will find them in a state of considerable disorder, the correspondence ceased, the accounts unclear, the entire enterprise frozen, as thoroughly as everything else in my life has been, these past 5 years, and I require someone who can resurrect it properly, not merely shuffle papers to justify a salary I provide out of misguided pity." He gestured to a leather case he had set beside his chair, continuing, "You may take the evening to review the materials, to determine whether the work is genuine and whether you are capable of undertaking it, and you may send your answer to me by tomorrow morning. If you decline, I shall seek elsewhere, and we need never speak of this again." Eleanor's aunt, who had been sitting quietly by the fire throughout this exchange, spoke for the first time, her voice quavering but determined. "Your Grace is most generous, but you must understand our position. We cannot afford the appearance of impropriety, and my niece's reputation is all she possesses beyond her character." The Duke's expression remained impassive as he inclined his head toward the elderly woman. "Mrs. Hartley, I assure you the position is entirely proper. Miss Hartley would work primarily from Ashford Manor, under the supervision of my housekeeper. Her lodging would be in the guest wing with her own suite of rooms, and all correspondence would be conducted with appropriate formality. I am offering employment, nothing more and certainly nothing less." That night, after he had departed, leaving behind the leather case of documents, Eleanor and her aunt sat together reviewing the Foundation's records by candlelight, and what Eleanor discovered was exactly as he had described: a charitable enterprise of considerable scope that had indeed ceased all operations 5 years previous. The final entries in her predecessor's hand, showing disbursements to orphanages, hospitals, schools for the poor, widows' funds, and a dozen other causes now abandoned, and the work required to resurrect such an undertaking would be genuine and substantial, demanding intelligence, dedication, and organizational skill far beyond the mere pretense of employment. Her aunt's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, her voice soft as she spoke what they both knew. "My dear, the physician's bills from last month remain unpaid, and I fear my condition grows worse. With each chill we have, perhaps 3 months' funds remaining, if we are very careful, and after that." She did not finish the sentence, did not need to, for Eleanor knew precisely what came after their funds were exhausted, knew the cold mathematics of poverty and illness, and knew that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford, even as her heart rebelled against accepting what might still be pity, dressed as employment. The next morning, Eleanor sent her answer to Ashford House, accepting the position, with one stipulation written in her careful script, that if at any time the Duke found her work unsatisfactory, or if she discovered the position to be charity rather than genuine employment, either party might terminate the arrangement immediately, without explanation or obligation, for she would maintain her dignity even in accepting his offer, would ensure that what she received was earned through her own capability rather than granted through his compassion. And if that pride was foolish in the face of their desperate circumstances, then it was a foolishness she could not seem to relinquish, no matter how loudly practicality argued against it. The carriage journey from London to Ashford Manor consumed the better part of a day, carrying Eleanor through landscapes that shifted from the grey smoke of the city to the rolling hills of the countryside, their autumn colours muted beneath an overcast sky that seemed to mirror the uncertainty churning in her chest. And as the vehicle finally turned through iron gates onto a tree-lined drive, she caught her first glimpse of the estate that would become her home, a sprawling stone manor house of Jacobean architecture, its mullioned windows reflecting the dying afternoon light like watchful eyes, its chimneys rising against storm clouds with a severity that matched its owner's countenance. And there was about the entire edifice an air of magnificent melancholy, as though the house itself had frozen in grief alongside the Duke who inhabited it. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, awaited her in the entrance hall, a woman of perhaps 50 years whose iron-grey hair and rigid posture suggested discipline rather than warmth, and she received Eleanor with professional courtesy that stopped precisely short of welcome, showing her through corridors hung with portraits of Blackwell ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to judge this interloper from the middle classes, and up a grand staircase whose marble steps were worn smooth by generations of aristocratic feet, to a suite of rooms in the east wing that took Eleanor's breath with their unexpected grandeur. The bedchamber alone was larger than the entire ground floor of her London townhouse, furnished with pieces that would have fetched enough at auction to settle all her debts twice over, the bed hung with damask curtains in deep blue, the windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward distant woods, and Eleanor stood in the center of this luxury, feeling like an impostor, her worn traveling dress and single trunk of belongings emphasizing the gulf between her circumstances and this setting, though she lifted her chin with determination and thanked Mrs. Winters with dignity that refused to acknowledge the disparity. The library, where she was to conduct her work, proved even more overwhelming, a two-story chamber lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, tall windows letting in the grey afternoon light, a massive desk positioned before the fireplace, with papers stacked in careful order awaiting her attention, and here Eleanor discovered the first evidence of the late Duchess, for one entire section of shelving contained nothing but the Foundation's records, correspondence files, account ledgers, all frozen at a moment 5 years previous, when the woman who had created this charitable enterprise had ceased to exist. That first evening, alone in the library after Mrs. Winters had departed, Eleanor began her examination of the work that would justify her salary, and what she found was a portrait of a woman painted not in oils but in careful script, in notations about orphans' schooling and widows' pensions, in letters that radiated warmth and genuine concern for those the Duchess of Ashford had sought to help, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten as she realized this was not merely abandoned administrative work, but rather a frozen monument to interrupted compassion, to a life cut short mid-sentence, to grief so profound that the Duke had been unable to touch these records without touching the ghost of his beloved wife. The room itself bore evidence of his abandonment, dust motes dancing in the firelight, ledgers that no hand had opened in half a decade, correspondence still arranged as though awaiting responses that would never come, and Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that in accepting this position she had agreed not merely to resurrect a charitable foundation, but to disturb the careful preservation of grief, to animate what had been deliberately frozen, and the weight of that responsibility settled upon her shoulders alongside her determination to honor both the Duke's late wife and the work itself, to prove that this opportunity was earned through capability rather than received through pity, even as she acknowledged to herself that the coldness she had perceived in the Duke might be nothing more than ice formed over a wound that had never properly healed. Eleanor's first week at Ashford Manor unfolded in the library's quiet isolation, each day revealing new layers of the Foundation's former scope as she worked through correspondence files that documented a web of charitable connections spanning the entire county and beyond orphanages in London that had received quarterly stipends, a school for the deaf that the late Duchess had personally funded, hospitals that had relied on regular donations for their charity wards, widows' societies that had distributed food and fuel to the destitute, and dozens of individual families whose letters spoke of Catherine Blackwell's personal involvement in their lives, her remembrance of children's names and birthdays, her understanding that charity was not merely the distribution of funds, but the recognition of human dignity in those who received it. The Duke avoided Eleanor with what seemed like deliberate intention, communicating only through terse notes delivered by footmen, instructions about budgets, permissions to access certain files, responses to her questions that contained no more words than absolutely necessary, and she found herself working in a silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the scratch of her pen as she began the painstaking process of drafting letters to resume these abandoned connections, explaining the hiatus, requesting updates on circumstances, offering the Foundation's renewed support if it was still needed or desired. She wore her old gowns while working, the same faded dresses she had brought from London, though her salary would now permit the purchase of new ones. But old habits of frugality died hard, and she could not quite bring herself to spend money on personal adornment when her aunt's medical bills remained unpaid and their London debts still loomed. And besides, there was a certain comfort in familiar fabric, in garments that asked nothing of her but honest work, that made no pretensions to a status she did not truly occupy. It was on the fourth day, while searching for a specific ledger in the back shelving, that Eleanor discovered a locked drawer in the desk, and when she mentioned it in one of her notes to the Duke, he sent back the key without comment, and inside she found bundles of personal correspondence between the Duke and his late wife, letters from their courtship and early marriage that she knew she should not read, but found herself unable to resist. And what she discovered there shook her understanding of the cold man who now inhabited this frozen house. The letters revealed a love match of extraordinary depth, not the arranged marriage she had assumed, for here was Lucian Blackwell writing with warmth and humour and tender observation, describing his days to Catherine with details he thought might amuse her, confessing fears and hopes with a vulnerability that seemed impossible in the man she knew. And Catherine's responses showed equal devotion, equal intelligence, a meeting of minds as well as hearts. And Eleanor felt like an intruder reading these intimate exchanges, even as they compelled her forward, even as they made her wonder what catastrophic grief must be required to transform the man in these letters into the ice-cold Duke who could barely bring himself to acknowledge her presence in his house. That evening, she encountered him in the hallway outside the library, both of them stopping abruptly at the unexpected meeting, and in the candlelight she searched his face for some trace of the man who had written those letters. But his expression remained impassive, his grey eyes cold as he inquired whether she required anything for her work, and when she said no, he nodded once and continued past her, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the corridor wondering whether that warm, loving man was dead along with his wife, or merely buried so deep beneath ice that no thaw could ever reach him. And which possibility, she thought with uncomfortable self-awareness, troubled her more than it should, given that she was merely his employee, hired to resurrect his wife's charitable work, not to resurrect the man himself from the grief that had clearly claimed him as thoroughly as death had claimed Catherine Blackwell. Eleanor requested a meeting with the Duke after 2 weeks of working in isolation, her findings too significant to continue communicating through terse notes, and she sent her request through Mrs. Winters with a formality that masked her nervousness, for she had not spoken directly with him since that brief hallway encounter, and when word came back that he would receive her in his study at 3 o'clock, she found herself adjusting her faded grey gown with hands that trembled slightly, telling herself this anxiety stemmed purely from professional concern and not from the uncomfortable awareness that the man in those letters had begun to haunt her thoughts in ways that were decidedly improper for an employee. The study proved as severe as its owner, all dark wood and leather, the walls lined with books that looked more decorative than read, and the Duke sat behind a massive desk with the afternoon light from the tall windows, turning his grey eyes to silver as he gestured for her to sit, his expression one of carefully controlled patience, as though he were granting her an audience he could ill afford to spare. And Eleanor straightened her spine and began her presentation with a composure that refused to acknowledge his intimidating presence, spreading her carefully organized notes across the desk between them while explaining the scope of what his late wife had built. the dozens of charitable connections that had been severed by grief, the good work that awaited resurrection, if he would permit her to proceed. He listened with apparent disinterest, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, his fingers drumming once against the desktop in what might have been impatience, and Eleanor felt her determination hardening into something like defiance as she continued through her proposals, her voice growing stronger as she detailed budgets and priorities, until she mentioned Street, Anne's orphanage in Whitechapel, the institution Catherine had founded personally after witnessing children sleeping in doorways. And something shifted in the Duke's expression, a crack appearing in the ice as his eyes finally focused on Eleanor's face with an intensity that stole her breath. He asked, his voice rough as though from disuse, whether she had found correspondence regarding Street, Anne's. And when Eleanor produced the file she had set aside for this moment, he reached for it with hands that trembled visibly, a tremor he could not quite control, and she watched as he opened the folder and stared down at his late wife's handwriting, at descriptions of children's faces and progress reports written in Catherine's distinctive script, and the grief that crossed his features was so raw, so carefully unguarded for just that instant, that Eleanor felt as though she were witnessing something sacred and terrible, a glimpse beneath the frozen surface to the wound that had never healed. He asked, without looking up from the papers, whether Eleanor would read portions of the correspondence aloud, claiming the script was difficult in the afternoon light, though they both knew this for the lie it was, and she complied, her voice steady and gentle as she read Catherine's words about a girl named Margaret who had learned her letters, about a boy called Thomas who showed promise as an apprentice carpenter, about the joy of watching children transform from hollow-eyed desperation to cautious hope. And as Eleanor read, she saw the Duke's hands tighten on the desk's edge, saw him close his eyes against emotion he could not quite suppress, and she understood in that moment that his coldness was not cruelty, but rather the only defense he possessed against grief so profound it might otherwise consume him entirely. Their conversation extended beyond the business she had come to discuss, stretching into the late afternoon as he asked questions about other aspects of the foundation, about her impressions of Catherine's work, and though his voice remained controlled, there was a quality to his attention that suggested he was listening not merely to her words, but to the echo of his wife's compassion in Eleanor's commitment to honoring what Catherine had built. And when he finally noticed that she still wore her old grey gown, the same faded dress she had worn at the ball weeks before, he observed this with a directness that brought heat to her cheeks, asking whether her salary was insufficient to her needs, and Eleanor deflected with practiced grace, claiming she preferred simplicity while working, which was true enough, even if it concealed the deeper truth about debts and duties that consumed every penny she could spare. The meeting concluded with the Duke's permission to proceed with all her proposals, his agreement delivered in that same controlled voice that revealed nothing beyond professional approval, yet as Eleanor gathered her papers and rose to leave, she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret, something that might have been curiosity or perhaps reluctant respect, and she left the study with her heart beating faster than mere professional success could account for, aware that something had shifted between them in that hour, some small thaw in the frozen landscape of his grief, and as weeks passed and autumn deepened toward winter, she would find herself returning in memory to that moment when his hands had trembled over his wife's letters, to the vulnerability he had shown her despite himself, and she would wonder whether the warm man in those courtship letters might yet be rescued from the ice, even as she told herself sternly that such thoughts were the height of foolishness, that she was his employee and nothing more, that his grief belonged to a love so profound her own growing feelings were merely shadows by comparison, insignificant and inappropriate, and certainly not worth the examination she found herself unable to prevent. Weeks passed in the quiet rhythm of accumulated small moments, each one unremarkable alone yet together, forming something Eleanor had not anticipated when she first arrived at Ashford Manor, for the Duke began joining her in the library occasionally, his presence no longer announced by terse notes but by the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, the opening of the door, his silent settling into the chair opposite her desk, where he would review ledgers or correspondence while she worked. And though their conversations remained formal, they grew longer, extending beyond mere business into discussions of literature when he noticed what she was reading, or politics when the newspapers arrived from London, or philosophy when some passage in Catherine's letters prompted reflection on Charity's true nature. He corrected her when she worked too late, appearing in the library doorway as the autumn darkness gathered early and pointing out with dry observation that she was straining her eyes by inadequate candlelight, and though his tone held no warmth, there was something in the gesture itself that suggested concern rather than mere employer's duty, and Eleanor found herself noticing these small attentions with a frequency that troubled her, cataloguing them in memory like precious things she had no right to treasure. She noticed, too, that he had begun asking her opinions on matters beyond the foundation, seeking her thoughts on estate improvements or tenant concerns, listening to her responses with an attention that suggested he valued her perspective, not merely as his employee, but as someone whose judgment he had come to respect. And there was a subtle shift in how he addressed her, the frost gradually melting from his voice when he said, "Miss Hartley," so that her name became less formal pronouncement and more something approaching natural conversation. Eleanor discovered unexpected humor beneath his severity, a dry and dark wit that emerged in brief flashes of observation about the absurdities of society or the pretensions of his peers. Comments delivered with such deadpan solemnity that it took her a moment to recognize them as jests, and when she laughed despite herself, he would glance at her with something that might have been satisfaction, though his expression never quite reached a smile. And she began to anticipate these moments with a pleasure she knew was dangerous, this evidence that the warm man from those courtship letters still existed somewhere beneath the ice. Mrs. Winters remarked one morning while bringing tea that the Duke seemed less frozen than before, that there was something different in his manner since Miss Hartley's arrival, and though the housekeeper's tone remained professionally neutral, there was approval in her eyes, and Eleanor heard similar observations in the whispers of housemaids and footmen, the servants' gossip that travelled through the manor's corridors, speaking of their master's gradual thaw, and she told herself sternly that she was merely fulfilling her professional duties, that any change in the Duke's demeanour stemmed from the resurrection of his wife's charitable work, and not from Eleanor's presence specifically. Yet she could not quite convince herself of this comfortable lie. She acknowledged privately, in the quiet moments before sleep when honesty could not be avoided, that she had begun to care about him beyond professional respect, that somewhere in these weeks of accumulated small gestures and lengthening conversations, she had developed feelings that were decidedly improper for an employee toward her employer, feelings that made her heart quicken when she heard his footsteps approaching the library, that made her acutely aware of his presence across the desk, that filled her with foolish hope whenever his grey eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessity required, and she knew this path led only to heartbreak, for he was a duke, still mourning his beloved wife, and she was merely the poor relation he had hired out of some combination of duty and possibly guilt. Yet knowing this did nothing to prevent her heart from its betrayal, from its insistence on caring despite all reason, and as October advanced toward November and the foundation work brought them into ever closer collaboration, Eleanor found herself caught between the professional composure she maintained in his presence and the growing emotional truth she could acknowledge only in solitude, aware that she was falling into something from which there would be no graceful retreat, no protection against the inevitable pain, when this temporary arrangement ended and she returned to her former life, but unable, despite this knowledge, to guard her heart as wisdom demanded, and for the Duke's gradual transformation, from frozen isolation to something approaching human connection, was too compelling to resist, too precious to witness without becoming invested in its continuation, and Eleanor accepted with melancholic resignation that she would carry the cost of these feelings long after she left Ashford Manor, that caring for Lucian Blackwell would leave marks on her heart as permanent as the carefully mended seams in her faded gowns. A fierce October storm arrived without warning on an evening when Eleanor's aunt was visiting neighbours in the village, the sky darkening to bruised purple as wind howled around Ashford Manor's stone walls, and rain lashed against the tall windows, with such violence that Eleanor abandoned any thought of returning to her rooms, choosing instead to remain in the library where she worked through dinner, absorbed in correspondence with a hospital in Manchester that Catherine had supported, so focused on her task that she barely noticed the passage of hours until the Duke appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of food, an unprecedented gesture that made her look up in startled surprise, as he explained with dry observation that Mrs. Winters feared she would work herself into illness if someone did not intervene, and Eleanor accepted the meal with murmured thanks while he settled into the chair opposite hers, the thunder rolling overhead and lightning illuminating the room in brilliant flashes that threw strange shadows across the book-lined walls and created an atmosphere of enforced intimacy, as though the storm had isolated them from the ordinary world and its careful proprieties. He did not leave after delivering the meal but remained, reviewing papers with apparent concentration, though Eleanor sensed his attention was not fully engaged, and when she rose to examine the portrait of Catherine that hung above the fireplace, a beautiful woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile, she expected him to withdraw or grow cold, yet instead he joined her before the painting and began to speak about his wife with an openness he had never before displayed, describing Catherine's warmth and her instinctive compassion for those in need, her laughter that had filled these rooms with joy. And then his voice grew quieter as he told Eleanor what he had never spoken aloud in the 5 years since her death, the terrible day when Catherine had labored to bring their child into the world and failed, when both mother and infant had slipped away despite the best physicians money could summon, and the guilt he carried for being unable to save them, for watching helplessly as everything he loved was torn from him in hours of agony that haunted him still. Eleanor listened with tears gathering in her eyes, not from pity but from recognition of grief so profound it had frozen him in self-protection, and when he finished speaking she found herself sharing her own losses in return, describing her mother's long decline from consumption, the way Eleanor had nursed her through months of suffering only to lose her regardless, and then her father's death a year later that had left Eleanor and her aunt destitute, cast from comfortable life into genteel poverty with its careful economies and quiet desperation. And as she spoke, she saw in the Duke's face the mutual recognition of shared grief, the understanding that they had both endured losses that marked them permanently, that shaped how they moved through a world that seemed careless in its cruelty. The thunder crashed directly overhead, and the lightning illuminated them, frozen in that moment of communion. Two people who had learned to guard their hearts standing together before the portrait of a woman whose absence had defined both their lives, his through direct loss, Eleanor's through the charitable work that had become her purpose, and the emotional breakthrough that passed between them was not dramatic, but quiet and profound, a settling of understanding that neither had expected when the storm began, but which felt inevitable now, as though the accumulated weeks of small gestures and lengthening conversations had been leading toward this honest exchange of pain. And when the Duke finally turned from Catherine's portrait to meet Eleanor's eyes, there was something different in his expression, a softening of the ice that had protected him, a willingness to be seen in his vulnerability that he had shown no one since his wife's death. And Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that she was witnessing his first real step toward healing, toward allowing himself to feel something beyond frozen grief. And the knowledge that she had played some small part in this thawing filled her with a tenderness she could not quite name and dared not examine too closely, for the boundaries between them remained even as something essential had shifted in the storm-darkened library. The local assembly arrived 3 weeks after the storm, an annual gathering of the county's gentry held in the modest assembly rooms of the nearby market town, and Eleanor received an invitation addressed to her as the Duke's Foundation Director, a gesture of respect from the local families who had begun to notice the charitable work's revival under her management, and though she might have declined, she found herself accepting, partly from professional duty and partly from a desire to prove she could face society again without the shame that had marked her earlier encounters. And so she prepared for the evening wearing her familiar gown, the pale blue silk that had been her mother's favorite, retrimmed once more with fresh ribbon purchased from her salary, the fabric showing its age in the slight fading along the seams and the thinness of the material where it had been altered and re-altered over 3 seasons of use, yet still presentable enough for a country assembly, or so Eleanor believed as she descended the stairs of Ashford Manor, where the Duke waited to escort her. His expression unreadable as he noted her dress but said nothing, merely offering his arm with formal courtesy that had become familiar over the months of their growing connection. The assembly rooms were warm and crowded when they arrived, filled with local families and minor gentry, who greeted the Duke with respectful deference, and Eleanor with curious interest for her position at Ashford Manor had sparked speculation among the county society, and she moved through the rooms with careful composure, discussing the foundation's work with several ladies who had offered donations and accepting compliments on the revival of Catherine's charitable projects. Yet, as the evening progressed, she felt the familiar weight of being observed, of being assessed, and found somehow wanting despite her respectable position, and when she moved toward the refreshment room to escape the scrutiny for a moment, her gown caught on a protruding door hinge that some careless servant had failed to repair properly, and the fabric, worn thin from years of use and too many careful mendings, tore with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the crowded space, ripping dramatically from hem to hip in a gash that exposed her petticoat and the skin of her leg beneath, and Eleanor froze in mortification as heads turned toward the sound, as she tried desperately to gather the torn fabric to cover herself, as whispers erupted around her like wildfire spreading through dry grass, and she saw in the faces surrounding her the same cruel amusement she had witnessed in that London ballroom 3 seasons ago, the same judgment that reduced her to nothing more than the poor relation in the worn-out gown, and her composure shattered as tears of humiliation gathered in her eyes, and her hands trembled, trying to hold the ruined silk together. The Duke witnessed this from across the room where he had been conversing with the local magistrate, and in the space of a heartbeat, something transformed in his expression. The careful control he maintained, cracking to reveal fury so intense, it silenced the whispers around Eleanor, and he crossed the distance between them in swift strides that made the crowd part instinctively and in an unprecedented action that would be discussed in the county for months afterward. He removed his own coat without hesitation and wrapped it around Eleanor's shoulders, the fine wool falling to her knees and covering the torn gown completely, and then, before she could protest or resist, he swept her into his arms as though she weighed nothing and carried her toward the door, his face set in lines of such cold rage that no one dared speak or laugh, and Eleanor found herself pressed against his chest, hearing the rapid beat of his heart as he moved through the assembly rooms, ignoring every stare and shocked expression, and he carried her to his waiting carriage, despite her whispered protests that she could walk, that he was creating a scandal, that everyone would talk. Yet he seemed not to hear, or perhaps not to care, as he settled her on the velvet seat and took his place beside her, calling to his driver to make haste to Ashford Manor, and only when they were moving through the dark countryside did he speak, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before, an anger that was not directed at her but at the circumstances that had forced such economy, at the society that valued appearance over character, at his own blindness in not preventing this humiliation, and Eleanor understood through her tears that the Duke's fury was entirely on her behalf, a fierce protectiveness that shook something loose in her carefully guarded heart. In the carriage, Eleanor sat trembling beneath the weight of the Duke's coat, the fine wool still carrying the warmth of his body and the faint scent of sandalwood and leather, while outside the horses moved swiftly through the darkness toward Ashford Manor, and inside the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotion, until the Duke spoke with a roughness in his voice she had never heard before, demanding to know why she had not used her salary to purchase new gowns, why she had continued wearing fabric so worn it could not withstand the simple act of passing through a doorway, and Eleanor felt fresh tears gather as she explained with quiet dignity that every penny of her wages had been saved for her aunt's medical care, for the physician visits that grew more frequent as the elderly woman's heart weakened, for the medicines that provided some small comfort, and for the old debts her father had left unpaid when he died, obligations of honor that must be settled regardless of their current poverty. And she would not spend money on herself when others depended upon her, when her aunt had sacrificed so much to keep them both respectable after Eleanor's world had collapsed, and the Duke listened with his jaw clenched and something blazing in his grey eyes that was not anger at her but at circumstances, at a world that forced such choices upon women of intelligence and character, and when she finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment before he said in a voice barely above a whisper that he had seen her pride and her strength from that first night in London, when she stood alone at the periphery of the ballroom, refusing to bow beneath the weight of society's judgment. And what he felt in that moment was not pity but something far more dangerous, something he had believed himself incapable of feeling again, a recognition that beneath her worn silk and careful economy lived a spirit that matched his own in its fierce refusal to surrender to grief or circumstance, and Eleanor looked at him in the darkness of the carriage, seeing his face illuminated by passing moonlight, and understanding that something essential had shifted between them tonight. That the careful boundaries of employer and employee had been irreparably crossed when he swept her into his arms before an assembly room full of witnesses, and she did not know whether to feel terror or relief at this development, only that her heart beat with painful intensity against her ribs, and her breath came shallow and quick. That night the Duke could not sleep, pacing the length of his chambers while the house settled into silence around him, thinking of Eleanor's tears and her torn gown, and the way she had accepted humiliation with such fierce dignity, thinking of how she had saved every penny for her aunt while wearing fabric that proclaimed her poverty to anyone who cared to notice. And before dawn, he made a decision that felt both reckless and utterly necessary, summoning his secretary to send an urgent message to London's most fashionable modiste, with instructions to arrive at Ashford Manor by afternoon, bringing fabric samples and fashion plates and everything necessary to outfit a lady of quality. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find a note requesting her presence in the drawing room, and when she arrived, still wearing one of her old gowns, she found the Duke standing beside a small, elegant woman, surrounded by bolts of silk and muslin in every imaginable color, and Eleanor understood immediately what he intended, and her pride flared hot and immediate as she refused with barely controlled fury, declaring she would not accept charity disguised as generosity, that she had accepted his employment on the condition it be genuine work, and not pity. And if he thought one moment of public humiliation entitled him to dress her like a doll, he was thoroughly mistaken, and the Duke met her anger with his own. Their first real argument, conducted in voices that remained controlled, but carried an intensity that made the modiste step back nervously, his autocratic insistence meeting her fierce independence in a clash of wills that neither seemed prepared to surrender, until finally he spoke the words that broke through her resistance, saying quietly and with devastating sincerity that she honored his wife's work with dignity and dedication, that she had brought Catherine's charitable vision back to life when he had been too frozen in grief to preserve it himself, and he asked only that she allow him to honor her work in return, to provide her with garments suitable to the position she held. And Eleanor stood trembling with the force of her conflicting emotions, understanding that this was not charity but recognition, not pity but respect, and perhaps something more that neither of them dared yet name. The fitting sessions began the following morning and continued over several days, transforming the quiet library into a temporary workshop where the modiste measured and draped, while Eleanor attempted to maintain focus on her correspondence. The woman's skilled hands moving over Eleanor's shoulders and waist with professional efficiency as she murmured notes to her assistant about alterations and proportions, and Eleanor found herself experiencing a peculiar mixture of wonder and discomfort as bolts of silk and muslin were held against her skin for comparison, colors she had not worn in years because such fabrics had become impossibly beyond her means, the deep emerald that brought out the green in her hazel eyes, the sapphire blue that recalled her mother's favorite shade, the ivory silk so fine it seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, streaming through the library windows, and though she tried to work through the fittings, she could not help but run her fingers over the materials with barely concealed longing, remembering what it felt like to wear something beautiful not because it had been carefully mended and retrimmed, but because it was simply new and lovely. Yet even as she marveled at the fabrics, she remained uncomfortable with the expense, with the knowledge that the Duke was providing this when she had insisted their arrangement be one of employment rather than charity, and she caught herself more than once on the verge of stopping the entire process before reminding herself of his words about honoring her work as she honored Catherine's, though whether she truly believed this rationalization or simply wanted an excuse to accept what her pride would otherwise refuse, she could not entirely determine. The Duke observed these sessions from the library doorway more than once, though he pretended not to when Eleanor glanced in his direction. His presence felt even when he remained silent as the modiste worked, and Eleanor wondered what he saw when he looked at her draped in fine fabrics, whether he was comparing her to Catherine or simply ensuring his investment in her wardrobe was proceeding appropriately. Yet she could not ask, and he did not offer explanation, maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their relationship, even as something unspoken shifted between them after the night of the torn gown. And when the first completed dress arrived 1 week later, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chamber, feeling almost like a stranger to herself. The deep emerald silk transforming her appearance in ways she had not anticipated, the color bringing warmth to her complexion, and the expert tailoring, creating an elegance that her old gowns could never achieve, regardless of how carefully she had maintained them. And she descended the stairs that evening for dinner, with her heart beating faster than the occasion warranted, uncertain why this particular dress made her feel so vulnerable. And the Duke stood in the entrance hall in conversation with his steward regarding some matter of estate business when he saw her, and he stopped mid-sentence as though his thoughts had scattered completely, his carefully controlled expression cracking for just a moment to reveal something that looked almost like wonder before he mastered himself again, though his eyes remained fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And when the steward departed, he approached her with formal courtesy and asked if she would do him the honor of dining with him that evening, not as his employee, but as his companion, a request that shifted the ground beneath their carefully maintained boundaries, and Eleanor accepted with equal formality, though her hands trembled slightly as he offered his arm to escort her to the dining room. And that evening, their conversation flowed with an ease that had been building over months of accumulated moments, but had never quite emerged until now, their words ranging from the foundation's work to literature to observations about the changing season. And as autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor understood that something irrevocable had begun between them, something that both terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Winter arrived at Ashford Manor with a silence that seemed to blanket the world in white, transforming the estate into something both beautiful and austere, and under Eleanor's careful management, the foundation work expanded beyond what even the Duke had anticipated. The correspondence she had initiated in autumn, now bearing fruit as schools reopened their doors to children who had been turned away for lack of funds, as hospitals received donations that allowed them to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay, as families who had struggled through 5 years without support found themselves once again connected to the charitable network Catherine had built. And Eleanor found herself working alongside the Duke daily, as they visited tenant families in their cottages to assess their needs for the harsh season ahead, traveled to nearby villages to inspect the charitable institutions that relied upon the foundation's support, and spent long hours in the library drafting letters and reviewing accounts. And during these shared labors, small touches accumulated like snowflakes building into drifts, his hand steadying her elbow when they walked together on icy paths, his immediate attention when he noticed her shivering despite her cloak, as he insisted she accept his warmer wrap, his quiet observations when she worked too late into the evening that she looked tired and should rest, gestures that might have seemed merely courteous from an employer, but which carried an unmistakable quality of personal concern that made Eleanor's heart beat faster, even as she tried to maintain appropriate distance between them. She observed his transformation with wonder and growing trepidation, watching as the ice that had encased him since Catherine's death continued its slow thaw, the grey eyes that had been so cold when she first met him, now warming when they rested upon her. And he smiled occasionally at something she said, a real smile that transformed his severe features into something almost gentle. And once she even heard him laugh at a wry observation she made about a particularly pompous charity administrator, a sound so unexpected that she stopped mid-sentence in surprise, and the household staff noticed these changes with knowing glances and whispered conversations in the servants' hall, Mrs. Winters remarking to the butler that the master seemed less frozen than he had been in all the years since the Duchess died, that Miss Hartley had somehow accomplished what no one else had managed, bringing warmth back to Ashford Manor simply through her steady presence and quiet competence. Yet even as Eleanor witnessed and contributed to this transformation, she felt her own internal conflict intensify with each passing day. The growing feelings she harbored for the Duke warring against the impossible reality of their situations, for she remained technically his employee. Despite the evenings they now spent dining together and the easy conversations that flowed between them, and he was still a duke, while she was the daughter of minor gentry who had died leaving nothing but debts, and society would never accept such a union, regardless of whatever genuine affection might exist between them. and she knew with painful certainty that loving him was both inevitable and foolish, that she should guard her heart against hopes that could never be realized. Yet her heart betrayed her with every small kindness he showed, every moment his hand lingered on hers when passing documents, every time his eyes found her across a room with an expression that made her breath catch, and she lay awake at night in her beautiful chamber, wearing one of the silk nightgowns the modiste had provided, and acknowledged to herself that she had fallen in love with a man she could never have, that the careful boundaries between employer and employee had dissolved, without her noticing, until it was far too late to protect herself, and the knowledge filled her with both joy and despair in equal measure. As winter deepened around Ashford Manor and Christmas approached with all its promises of hope and celebration. Christmas arrived at Ashford Manor with the promise of celebration, though Eleanor had initially planned to return to her modest townhouse to spend the holiday with her elderly aunt, a prospect that filled her with both duty and melancholy, since it would mean leaving the Duke and the estate that had become more home to her than anywhere she had lived since her parents' deaths. Yet when word arrived that her aunt had been invited to stay with neighbors for the season and was quite content in their company, Eleanor found herself both relieved and uncertain, for it meant she would remain at Ashford Manor through the holidays with no clear reason to depart, and the Duke found her in the library 2 days before Christmas, examining correspondence from one of the Foundation's orphanages, and asked with careful formality whether she might consider remaining at the manor to help him resume the traditional Christmas celebrations that Catherine had once hosted for the tenants and staff, celebrations that had not occurred in the 5 years since her death, and Eleanor saw in his grey eyes something that looked almost like hope, mixed with trepidation, as he explained that he thought perhaps it was time to bring warmth back to Ashford Manor during the season that most demanded it, and she agreed with a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the work itself and everything to do with the way he looked at her when she accepted. The days that followed were filled with preparations that transformed the melancholic manor into something alive with possibility, Eleanor and the Duke working side by side to oversee the decorating of the great hall with holly and ivy, brought in from the estate grounds, planning the Christmas feast with Mrs. Winters, who seemed delighted to see the old traditions restored, and selecting small gifts for the tenant children from the nearby village. And during these shared labors, Eleanor felt the barriers between them continuing to dissolve in ways both wonderful and terrifying, their hands brushing as they hung garlands along the banister, and their shoulders touching as they bent together over lists of preparations. And once when they were hanging holly above the library door, their hands met on the same branch, and neither pulled away immediately, the moment extending until Eleanor's breath caught, and the Duke's fingers tightened slightly over hers before he released the branch with what seemed like reluctance. And later that evening, as they sat before the fire in the drawing-room, reviewing the final preparations, he spoke with unexpected vulnerability about how he had not celebrated Christmas since Catherine died, how the joy of the season had seemed like a betrayal of his grief, but that Eleanor had somehow made him remember that joy need not diminish the love he had felt for his late wife, that perhaps one could honor the past while still embracing the present, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this confession, though she blinked them away and told him quietly that she thought Catherine would have wanted him to find happiness again, and that grief honored through perpetual darkness served no one, and he looked at her with such intensity that she had to glance away before her heart revealed itself entirely. The Christmas feast itself was a transformation of the manor into something warm and celebratory. The great hall filled with tenants and staff who had not gathered for such festivities in half a decade, the tables laden with traditional dishes, and the air rich with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. And Eleanor wore one of her new silk gowns, a deep burgundy that seemed appropriate for the season, and the Duke was openly attentive to her throughout the evening, in ways that did not escape the notice of the assembled company, ensuring she had the best portions of food, bringing her mulled wine when her cup emptied, laughing at her observations about the various guests with a warmth that made Mrs. Winters exchange knowing glances with the butler, and the gossip among the servants intensified with speculation about what exactly was developing between the master and Miss Hartley, whether employment might transform into something more permanent and intimate. And as the evening drew toward its close, the Duke led Eleanor through the decorated hall to show her something, and they found themselves standing beneath the kissing bough that hung in the entrance hall. Sprigs of mistletoe and holly twisted together with red ribbon, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other as the sounds of celebration faded into background noise, his hand lifting to touch her face with a gentleness that made her tremble, and she saw in his eyes an emotion that went beyond gratitude or friendship into territory that both thrilled and frightened her. And he leaned toward her slowly as though giving her time to retreat, and her own eyes fluttered closed in anticipation, but at the last moment, before their lips could meet, he pulled back sharply, conflict written across his features, and Eleanor opened her eyes to see him stepping away with what looked almost like pain, and he apologized in a voice rough with suppressed emotion, before turning and leaving her standing alone beneath the kissing bough, with her heart racing and her hands shaking, and the knowledge that whatever lay between them had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored or dismissed as merely the natural warmth between employer and employee. And she retreated to her chamber that night with the certain understanding that something would have to break or change, that they could not continue suspended in this state of unacknowledged longing, and she lay awake listening to the wind against the windows and wondering whether the new year would bring resolution or heartbreak to what had begun so unexpectedly in autumn. January arrived at Ashford Manor with bitter cold that seemed to seep through stone and mortar, frost painting intricate patterns on every window, and ice transforming the estate grounds into a landscape of crystalline beauty and treacherous paths. And it was during the second week of this harsh month that word arrived which shattered the fragile peace Eleanor had found in her life at the manor, a hastily written note from her aunt's neighbour, informing her that the elderly woman had fallen gravely ill with a fever that showed no signs of breaking, and Eleanor stood in the library holding this letter, with hands that trembled not from the cold but from sudden fear, for her aunt was the last remaining family she possessed in this world, and the thought of losing her brought back memories of her mother's long decline and her father's sudden death with painful clarity. And when the Duke found her thus standing frozen before the window, he read the situation in her pale face and trembling hands before she spoke a word, and his reaction was immediate and decisive in a way that revealed the depth of feeling he had been carefully controlling, insisting that she must depart at once for London, that his own carriage would convey her and be placed at her disposal for as long as needed. And when Eleanor attempted to refuse this generosity out of habitual pride, he spoke with barely controlled emotion that her aunt's welfare was not a matter for negotiation, that he would provide the best physicians money could secure and pay all expenses without question or expectation of repayment, and Eleanor found herself torn between the fierce independence that had sustained her through years of hardship and the desperate need to accept help for her aunt's sake, and ultimately love for the woman who had sheltered her after her father's death overcame pride, and she accepted his offer with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her voice that made something flicker in the Duke's grey eyes before he turned away to issue rapid orders to his household staff. The journey to London was accomplished with remarkable speed despite the winter conditions, and Eleanor arrived at her modest townhouse to find her aunt indeed desperately ill, fevered and barely conscious, and she threw herself into the work of nursing with the same focused determination she had once applied to the Foundation's correspondence, sitting vigil through long nights and attending to every detail of care, and true to his word, the Duke sent the finest physicians in London, who examined her aunt with grave faces and prescribed treatments that Eleanor could never have afforded on her own, and deliveries began arriving at the townhouse with frequency that astonished the neighbours. Coal for the fires to keep the sick room warm, fine foods to tempt an invalid's appetite, medicines from apothecaries known to serve only the wealthiest families, and blankets of such quality that Eleanor knew they must have come from Ashford Manor itself, and she accepted these gifts with gratitude that was tempered by the strange ache of missing the Duke, with an intensity that surprised her, for she had grown so accustomed to his presence in her daily life that his absence felt like a physical wound. Then, on the fourth day of her vigil, came an unexpected sound at the door, and Eleanor descended from the sick room with exhaustion evident in every line of her body, to find not a delivery, but the Duke himself, standing in her shabby parlour, looking entirely out of place among the worn furniture and faded curtains, and he explained with careful formality that he had come to inquire after her aunt's progress, but Eleanor saw through this pretense immediately, for his eyes betrayed a concern that went far beyond polite interest in an employee's family troubles. and they stood together in that modest room, surrounded by all the evidence of her former poverty, the threadbare carpet and the chair with its carefully mended upholstery, and the grate that burned coal only because he had provided it. And the Duke's real purpose became unmistakably clear when he took her hands in his own and spoke with a vulnerability she had never heard from him before, his voice low and rough with suppressed feeling, as he said that he had tried to remain at Ashford Manor, had told himself that her absence was temporary and he must simply wait for her return, but that he found he could not bear it, could not endure another day without seeing her and assuring himself of her welfare. And then he spoke words that Eleanor had not dared hope to hear, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, as he said, "I believed myself frozen beyond revival, Miss Hartley, a man who had lost the capacity for warmth or joy or any feeling beyond the grey acceptance of duty. But you have proven me wrong in every particular. You have brought light back into rooms that have been dark for 5 years, and I find that I cannot pretend any longer that what I feel for you is merely gratitude or professional respect, or anything so easily categorized and controlled." And Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack as she listened to this confession, her heart racing and her hands trembling in his grasp. And she knew in that moment that whatever barriers remained between them, whatever obstacles society might place in their path, the truth of their feelings had been spoken aloud at last and could not be taken back or dismissed or ignored, and the knowledge filled her with both terrified hope and the certain understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the Duke's confession brought an unexpected and unwelcome visitor to Eleanor's modest townhouse, for Lady Pemberton arrived in a carriage that seemed too grand for the shabby street, the Duke's elder sister descending with the practiced elegance of one accustomed to command, and entering the parlour with a formality that immediately put Eleanor on guard. And after the briefest of courtesies, Lady Pemberton came directly to the point with a pragmatism that was almost refreshing in its lack of pretense, saying that she had heard certain rumours concerning her brother's attachment to his employee and had come to assess the situation for herself, and Eleanor felt her spine stiffen with defensive pride, even as she maintained outward composure, recognizing in Lady Pemberton not cruelty, but rather the cool calculation of someone who understood society's rules with perfect clarity and saw the complications that genuine feeling could not overcome. Lady Pemberton was not unkind as she laid out the realities that Eleanor had already considered in her own sleepless nights, speaking of how a duke's marriage to a woman of Eleanor's background would create scandal that would follow them both through every ballroom and drawing-room in England, how whispers would suggest he had married beneath himself out of misplaced gratitude or worse motivations, how Eleanor would face the cutting remarks of women who had daughters they had hoped to see become duchesses, and how their children would bear the stigma of their mother's origins, no matter how exemplary her character or how genuine the affection between their parents. And Eleanor listened to this recitation with a sinking heart, because she recognized the truth in every word, even as she wished desperately to deny it. For she had grown up on the edges of society and knew well how unforgiving it could be to those who transgressed its invisible boundaries, and Lady Pemberton concluded by saying with what seemed like genuine regret that while she bore Eleanor no personal ill will, and could even acknowledge that her brother seemed happier than he had been in years, the wisest course would be for Eleanor to remove herself from the situation before matters progressed to a point where scandal became inevitable and damaging to them both. It was at this precise moment that the Duke himself arrived, entering the parlour with an expression that transformed from concern to fury as he grasped the nature of the conversation he had interrupted, and Eleanor watched as the cold anger she had thought forever melted from him returned in full force, but this time it was directed at his sister, in defence of Eleanor rather than at the world in general, and he spoke with a controlled rage that made Lady Pemberton actually step backward as he declared that he cared nothing for society's opinion or its suffocating expectations, that he had lived 5 years in frozen isolation, acceptable to every matron and dowager in London, and it had nearly destroyed him, and that he would not sacrifice the first genuine connection he had found since Catherine's death to preserve the good opinion of people whose regard was based on nothing more substantial than an accident of birth and inherited titles. Eleanor felt her heart breaking even as it swelled with love for him, for she saw in his fierce defence both the depth of his feeling and the potential for future regret. Saw how society's censure might wear on him over years until he looked at her with resentment instead of affection, and she recognized with painful clarity that loving him meant protecting him even from himself, even from choices made in the heat of emotion that might later be regretted in the cold light of social reality. And so, even as the Duke and Lady Pemberton continued their tense exchange, Eleanor made a decision that felt like tearing out her own heart, resolving that once her aunt recovered sufficiently, she would leave not just the townhouse, but London itself, would remove herself entirely from the Duke's orbit, so that he might find someone suitable to his position, someone who could stand beside him without occasioning whispers or creating scandal. And though the decision felt like choosing death over life, she told herself it was the final and greatest gift she could give him, the sacrifice of her own happiness for his long-term welfare and peace. Eleanor's aunt recovered slowly over the following weeks, the fever breaking at last, and strength returning by increments so gradual that each day seemed to bring barely perceptible improvement. And during this time of watchful waiting, Eleanor made her painful preparations for departure, composing a letter of resignation that she rewrote 7 times before achieving the proper tone of professional gratitude without revealing the devastation beneath each carefully chosen word. And when at last her aunt could sit up without assistance and take nourishment without difficulty, Eleanor knew she could delay no longer the decision that felt like severing her own limbs, and so she requested an audience with the Duke and delivered her notice with a composure that cost her every ounce of strength she possessed, informing him with manufactured calm that she had secured another position and would be leaving his employ within the fortnight, the lie sitting like ash on her tongue, but necessary to prevent him from offering solutions that would only prolong the agony of their impossible situation. The Duke's reaction was terrible in its restraint, for he did not rage or plead, but simply stood motionless before the library fire, with his back to her for a long moment, before turning to face her with an expression that combined devastation and bitter understanding, and he asked only one question, his voice low and carefully controlled as he said, "Is it society you fear, Miss Hartley, or my heart you doubt?" And Eleanor found herself unable to answer truthfully, without revealing the depths of her own feelings, without confessing that she loved him so desperately that the thought of leaving felt like choosing to stop breathing, and so instead she claimed with false steadiness that it was simply time to move forward with her life, that she was grateful for all he had done for her and her aunt, but that remaining at Ashford Manor indefinitely would be inappropriate given the circumstances. And she watched as something shuttered behind his eyes, and the coldness she thought forever melted began to reform, like ice crystallizing across still water, though this new frost was different from what she had first encountered, brittle and fractured rather than solid and impenetrable, as though it might shatter entirely at the slightest pressure. The days that followed were marked by excruciating formality, as they moved through the motions of concluding her employment, the Duke communicating through terse notes once more and avoiding her presence, except when absolutely necessary. And Eleanor packed her belongings with hands that trembled and eyes that burned with tears she refused to shed, and she made arrangements for her departure with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to the Foundation's correspondence, trying to lose herself in practical matters so she would not have to acknowledge the way her heart was breaking with each item she placed in her modest trunk. Then, on the night before her planned departure, a summons came, a brief note in the Duke's hand, requesting her presence in the library at 9 o'clock, and Eleanor descended the stairs with dread pooling in her stomach, to find the room lit only by firelight and a single branch of candles, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken emotion and the sound of winter, wind howling against the windows like a physical manifestation of the storm raging in her own chest, and the Duke stood before the fire with his back to the door until she entered, at which point he turned, and she saw in his face such carefully controlled anguish that she nearly went to him despite all her resolutions, and he crossed to his desk and retrieved a document which he presented to her with hands that were almost steady, explaining in a voice devoid of inflection that he had instructed his solicitors to draw up papers making her director of the charitable foundation, permanently and independently, with authority and income that would not require her continued residence at Ashford Manor, or indeed any connection to him beyond the professional oversight of the foundation's work, and he concluded by saying with devastating quietness, If you will not accept my heart, Miss Hartley, then accept this at least, and for the work you have done deserves recognition and security that does not depend upon my goodwill or continued favor." And Eleanor stood holding this document that represented both freedom and a kind of death, understanding that he was releasing her from any obligation while simultaneously ensuring she would never face the poverty and vulnerability that had once defined her existence, and the generosity of it, the selflessness wrapped in formal legal language, finally broke through the defenses she had constructed around her feelings and left her standing in the firelit library, with tears streaming down her face and her heart laid bare at last. Eleanor broke then, the careful composure she had maintained through weeks of impossible decisions shattering like the ice that had once encased the Duke's heart, and the words poured from her in a torrent she could no longer contain, her voice breaking as she confessed that she loved him with a desperation that terrified her, and that she had loved him, perhaps since the moment he had wrapped his coat around her torn gown and carried her from that assembly with such fierce protectiveness, but that she refused to be the instrument of his social ruin, refused to become the poor relation he married, out of misplaced obligation or pity, only to regret years later, when society's whispers wore away at whatever affection he felt now, refused to condemn their future children to bearing the stigma of their mother's inadequate birth and watching their father's reputation diminish because he had chosen feeling over prudence, and she told him through tears that leaving him was killing her, but staying would destroy them both eventually, and that she loved him too much to allow him to make a choice in passion that he might spend decades regretting in the cold reality of ballrooms and drawing rooms, where his Duchess would never be fully accepted, no matter how exemplary her character or conduct. The Duke moved then with sudden intensity, crossing the space between them in 2 strides and taking her face between his hands with a gentleness that contradicted the fierce emotion blazing in his eyes, and he lifted her chin until she had no choice but to meet his gaze fully, as he spoke, with an intensity that seemed to burn away the last remnants of the frost that had once defined him, saying that she misunderstood everything if she believed he would ever regret choosing her, that he had been dying before she arrived at Ashford Manor, existing but not living, frozen in a grief that was slowly turning him into something less than human, and that she had brought him back to life, not through any deliberate seduction or manipulation, but simply by being herself, by bringing intelligence and compassion and fierce independence to work that his late wife had loved, by seeing him as a man rather than a title, by challenging him and matching him and never once asking him to be anything other than what he was. He told her that he cared nothing for society's opinion compared to the genuine connection they had built together over months of working side by side, that he would rather face 1,000 cutting remarks and closed doors with her at his side than spend another day in the frozen isolation that society had found so acceptable when he was properly grieving and appropriately distant, and his proposal, when it came, was not dressed in flowery poetry or romantic declarations, but rather in the honest recognition of what they had built together through accumulated small moments and shared purpose, saying simply that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with the woman who had taught him that joy need not be betrayal of past love, that it was possible to honor what had been lost while still embracing what might be found, and would she do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife, not because he pitied her circumstances, but because he genuinely could not imagine his future without her presence illuminating it. Eleanor felt her resistance crumble under the absolute sincerity in his voice and eyes, felt all her careful arguments about social propriety and future regrets dissolve in the face of his unwavering certainty, and when he asked if she trusted him, trusted that he knew his own heart and mind well enough to make this choice with full understanding of its implications, she found herself nodding even as tears continued to stream down her face, and then his mouth was on hers in a kiss that was desperate and relieved, and filled with all the accumulated longing of months spent fighting an attraction that had grown despite every practical obstacle, and Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands finding their way into his dark hair as his arms pulled her against him with a possessiveness that sent heat rushing through her entire body. And in that firelit library with winter wind howling outside, they sealed their agreement to face whatever society might say or do together, choosing the genuine connection they had found over the easier path of separation and safety, choosing love over fear and possibility over the comfortable prison of isolation. Spring arrived with the kind of gentle insistence that made winter's harshness seem like a distant memory, and the Duke and Eleanor married in the chapel at Ashford Manor on a morning when apple blossoms drifted like snow across the grounds, and the air carried the scent of renewal and possibility, their wedding quiet by society standards, but rich with genuine feeling, as tenant families gathered alongside the few members of the ton whose affection for the Duke outweighed their concern for convention, and Lady Pemberton stood as witness with an expression that combined resignation and reluctant approval, for she had witnessed her brother's transformation over the preceding months, and could not deny that Eleanor had accomplished what 5 years of society's sympathy and careful matchmaking had failed to achieve, restoring warmth to a man she had feared lost forever to grief's frozen isolation. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace that the Duke had commissioned from London's finest modiste. Beautiful, not for its cost but for what it represented. A gift offered with respect rather than pity, acknowledgement of her worth rather than charity to ameliorate her poverty, and as she stood beside him speaking vows that promised partnership and mutual devotion, she thought briefly of the faded gown that had defined 3 seasons of her life, and felt no shame in the memory, but rather a kind of proud recognition that the woman who had worn that dress with dignity despite society's mockery had possessed strength enough to survive until this moment of transformation arrived. The wedding breakfast included not only the Duke's social equals, but also the families and individuals who benefited from the charitable foundation Eleanor now directed. An unprecedented mixing of classes that scandalized some guests and delighted others, and the Duke stood with his hand resting possessively at Eleanor's waist as he conversed easily with tenant farmers and titled lords alike. The frost that had once made him society's coldest bachelor entirely melted away to reveal the warm and engaged man he had been before. Grief froze his heart, and Eleanor watched him with wonder and love, understanding that his transformation was no more complete than her own, that they had each rescued the other from different forms of isolation and were building together something neither could have created alone. 3 years passed in a blur of quiet contentment and purposeful work, the foundation expanding under their joint management to support twice as many families and institutions as it had during the late Duchess Catherine's lifetime. And Eleanor discovered that wealth's greatest gift was not silk gowns or fine jewels, but rather the freedom to help others as she had once needed help, to offer dignity alongside assistance, and to recognize in each struggling family some echo of her own former desperation. While the Duke found in their partnership the kind of genuine connection he had believed lost forever, learning that the heart's capacity for love was not diminished by having loved before, but rather deepened by understanding love's preciousness and fragility. On an April evening when spring had come round again, they attended a ball in the same London ballroom where they had first encountered each other, Eleanor resplendent in emerald silk that complemented her eyes, while the Duke stood at her side with his hand at the small of her back, and they watched the dancers with the easy intimacy of a couple who had built their marriage on accumulated small moments of understanding rather than passionate declarations. Their infant daughter left sleeping peacefully at home in the care of the devoted Mrs. Winters, who had become as much family as servant over the years of Eleanor's residence at Ashford Manor, and Eleanor thought of the woman she had been 3 years prior, standing at this ballroom's periphery in her mother's altered gown, and felt no bitterness toward the society that had mocked her poverty, but rather gratitude for the circuitous path that had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life she could not have imagined in her darkest moments of struggle and shame. And when the Duke bent to murmur in her ear that she was by far the most beautiful woman present, she smiled and replied that he was quite possibly biased, and he answered with the warm humor that had replaced his former coldness that he was certainly biased, but also absolutely correct, and they moved together onto the dance floor, where once she would not have dared to venture, spinning through the waltz with the natural grace of partners who knew each other's movements as intimately as their own, transformed not from poverty to wealth or from loneliness to companionship, but rather from isolated endurance to supported flourishing, from frozen grief to thawing joy, from the cold distance of protective isolation to the vulnerable warmth of genuine connection. 5 years had passed since that spring wedding, and the library at Ashford Manor, where Eleanor and Lucian had first begun to truly know one another, now bore the comfortable evidence of a life built together through accumulated moments of understanding and shared purpose. The shelves that had once held only his late wife's carefully organized charitable correspondence now filled with ledgers documenting the foundation's expanded reach alongside children's books and the occasional toy soldier. Left behind by their twin sons, while their eldest daughter's primer rested on the desk where Eleanor had once worked, in solitary determination to prove herself worthy of the salary she earned, and the Duke would sometimes jest with warm affection about the torn gown that had changed everything, how a ripped seam and worn fabric had accomplished what months of working side by side had not quite achieved, forcing him to acknowledge the depth of feeling he had been fighting to contain. And Eleanor kept that faded silk gown carefully folded in a trunk in her dressing room, not from nostalgia for hardship, but rather as a tangible reminder of survival's quiet strength and of the woman who had maintained her dignity through 3 seasons of mockery and deprivation, whose pride and independence had been worth preserving even as circumstances transformed around her. And when their daughter asked about the old dress with its careful mends and replaced ribbons, Eleanor told her truthfully that it represented a time when outward appearances mattered less than inner character, when she had learned that genuine worth had nothing to do with the cost of one's clothing. And the Duke would add that her mother had been the most magnificent woman in any ballroom, regardless of what she wore, because true beauty emanated from strength of spirit and generosity of heart, qualities that silk and lace might enhance but could never create. Dear listener, perhaps you have noticed that the greatest transformations often come not through dramatic gestures or grand romantic declarations, but rather through the patient accumulation of small moments, the gradual thawing of hearts frozen by grief or disappointment, the courage required to remain vulnerable despite past hurts, and to recognize that genuine connection matters infinitely more than surface appearances or society's fickle approval. For Eleanor and Lucian's story teaches us that sometimes our greatest treasures arrive wrapped in worn fabric and cold exteriors, that what appears frozen beyond redemption may simply be waiting for the right warmth to thaw it, and that the patience to look beneath surfaces and see the person rather than the circumstances can lead us to connections we might otherwise have dismissed as impossible. Life presents us all with moments when we must choose between the safety of isolation and the risk of genuine connection, between maintaining protective walls and allowing another past our carefully constructed defenses. And while vulnerability requires tremendous courage, particularly after loss or disappointment, it remains the only path to the kind of deep partnership that transforms both individuals into something greater than either could have been alone. So perhaps as you navigate your own journey through seasons of hardship and plenty, remember that the faded gowns we wear with dignity matter less than the character we maintain while wearing them, that coldness in another may mask grief rather than genuine cruelty, and that the patience to wait for thawing, the wisdom to see beyond immediate appearances to lasting worth, can lead you to treasures you never imagined possible, even in your loneliest moments. May you find the courage to remain open to connection, even when circumstances seem impossibly difficult. May you recognize the difference between charity that diminishes and generosity that honors, and may you discover that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with patient understanding, not with dramatic rescue, but with mutual respect, not in ballrooms filled with silk and jewels, but in quiet libraries, where 2 wounded souls gradually learn to trust again. And may your own heart thaw and flourish in the warmth of genuine connection that sees your worth, regardless of your circumstances, honoring both who you have been and who you might yet become. If this story of Eleanor and Lucian has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs reminding that transformation is always possible, that frozen hearts can thaw, and that sometimes our greatest treasures come wrapped in the most unexpected packages.